Welcome, friends of Catholic Charities. My name is Mark Shriver. I'm talking a little bit about a book I wrote about my dad, Sargent Shriver, entitled A Good Man. As my dad was dying about 18 months ago, people came up and told me countless times that he was a good man, and after he died, they said the same thing as well. And I thought at first that it was just a nice phrase to say to someone who didn't know really what else to say to a person whose dad was dying. But I realized, as they said it time and time again, that they were really taking the phrase back, that they meant that my father was a good man. He may have been hailed by many as a great man on the public stage, but in real life, he was a good man, which is often paradoxically harder to do. I heard it from a whole range of people, whether it was Cardinal Wuerl, whether it was Vice President Biden. I also heard it from people like the waitresses that worked with my dad for over 35 years at his favorite restaurant, Reeves, down in Washington, D.C. The two of them showed up and waited in line for about 30 minutes at the wake and came in and just said, almost simultaneously, "Your father was a good man," and they turned around and walked out of the church. And I heard it from the guy at the U.S. air counter who told me about the times the dad used to come down and struggle to get through the security line and how he helped him and how, as he said, your father was a good man. And I heard it from my childhood friend, Brad Blank, who said to me that he had corresponded with my dad about the Judaic Studies program at Brown University. Brad blurted out, "Your father was such a good man, he used to write me letters about it. He was a mensch. Do you know what a mensch means?" And before I could answer, he said, "Your dad was a good man." And I realized as I heard these comments time and time again that I really needed to step back and find out what gave my father his incredible sense of balance, how he could be married to the woman of his dreams for 56 years, raise 5 kids, all of whom loved him, who had a successful career in business and in government, and who had countless friends and also a daily, personal, intense relationship with God. I also needed to get to understand the riddle of his joy, what made him so happy. He wasn't just a guy who went to Mass every day, but he was joyful in everything he did. And I realized that what really grounded my father in everything he did was his strong faith in a just and loving God, and that his faith demanded hope and it demanded love. I know it sounds corny, but as the president of the Chicago Board of Education, as the creator of the Peace Corps, VISTA, foster grandparents, legal services, Head Start, and most importantly, as his role as our father, it was all a way for him, I think, to spread love and to spread hope. I wanted to find out what made Dad so joyful, what made him live in the moment, to treat everyone the same, whether it was Cardinal Wuerl or whether it was those waitresses at this restaurant. He treated everyone the same and he lived in the moment. And I kept coming back to those 3 principles of faith, hope, and love. They were built really on each other, and they were the foundations of his life. His profound faith demanded hope, and his actions were a way to spread love. It all seemed to make sense. So I started to dig in to find out where that faith came from. I knew that he was a devout Catholic, and I knew that his mother and his father were also devout Catholics. I learned that his mom's father, who actually led Jeb Stuart to the Battle of Gettysburg, if you can believe that, had entered the seminary after the Civil War, only to become sick and drop out. He re-entered it and dropped out a second time, which he thinks which was a clear indication that he was not meant to be a priest. But in the seminary, he became great friends with a guy named James Gibbons, who would go on to not only become the second cardinal in America, but also my father's godfather. I learned that Grandma and Grandpa Shriver worked with the poor in Baltimore City and in New York City when they moved there just before the crash in 1929. My father often recounted how his family had lost their money during the Depression, and how his mother's faith kept the family together. I read his letters and learned that the Depression had robbed his father of the energy and vitality that the family had come to know, and just a few years after the Depression, his father died. My father had to rely on scholarships to put himself through Canterbury High School and through Yale and Yale Law School. I learned during the researching of this book that Dad had invited Dorothy Day up to Yale to speak to the undergraduates when he was in charge of the Catholic student organization. Clearly, his faith was instilled in him in a very early age. But I think during World War II, His faith was tested out on the USS South Dakota in the Battle of Santa Cruz and the Battle of Guadalcanal. I read in his letters to us how that ship lurched back and forth in the night and those battles raged, and he prayed that God would save his life, and how the next day he had to wake up and clean the remains of his shipmate and friends off the deck, but he never looked back. I think those battles fortified his faith in God and made it even stronger than it already was. I want to read you just a quick quote that I found in the research. When I started a program working with nonprofits, I took money from the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, and I got nervous that maybe I shouldn't do that because it wasn't a Catholic organization. And Dad addressed this issue in 1966 at Xavier University, and when he said, "Just 3 or 4 years ago, it was practically impossible for a federal agency to give a direct grant to a religious group. People said there was a wall between church and state, but we said that wall was put there to keep government out of the pulpit, not to keep the clergy away from the poor. That wall protects belief and even disbelief. It does not exclude compassion, poverty, suffering, and injustice. That is common territory, not exclusively yours or mine, but everyone's, with no wall between. And so we said, Reverend Mr. Jones, or Father Kelly, or Rabbi Hirsch, if you're not afraid to be seen in our company, we're not afraid to be seen in yours, because we are all about doing our Father's business." I thought that was an amazing quote about inclusive faith. And that faith demanded hope. When he went to work for Joe Kennedy in Chicago, running the largest building in America, the Merchandise Mart, he immediately became involved in social justice issues in that great city. He joined the Chicago Interracial Council, which was modeled on the Interracial Council in New York City that his parents had worked on. And he went to work with Cardinal Strick to integrate the Catholic hospitals and the Catholic schools in the Windy City. He was also appointed by Mayor Daley as head of the Chicago Board of Education, where he worked to integrate schools in that great city well before many other cities became integrated. And that was where he met Martin Luther King Jr. It was that relationship, I think, with Dr. King that helped swing the 1960 election to then Senator Kennedy, my uncle. Dr. King was arrested in Atlanta just a few weeks before the 1960 election. And many political leaders in the Deep South had told Senator Kennedy and his campaign that if Senator Kennedy said anything nice about Nikita Khrushchev, Jimmy Hoffa, or Dr. King, they were going to throw their support behind Richard Nixon. But that didn't deter my father. He had a relationship with Dr. King, and a few days after Dr. King was arrested in a hotel room in Chicago, Dad waited until the entire room had emptied, and he asked Senator Kennedy if he would call Coretta Scott King and express his concern for Dr. King. Actually, my uncle's closest aide, Kenny O'Donnell, went to the bathroom. And when he was in the bathroom, Daddy asked Senator Kennedy if he would make that call. Jack said, "Ring her up." Dad pulled out a piece of paper, dialed Coretta Scott King, and they spoke for a little under a minute. And it was a gesture, a strong enough gesture to swing Daddy King, who was a very influential Protestant minister who had endorsed Vice President Nixon, to change his mind and to support President Kennedy. And other prominent African-American ministers shortly followed suit. And the vote numbers changed in such numbers that it swung the African-American vote to Senator Kennedy and really ended up swinging the election to Senator Kennedy. Some have called it a shrewd political move, but I really think that my father saw it as a gesture of hope. He really thought it was an effort to try to address the racial strains in this country by having a very prominent politician reach out to Dr. King's wife and to try to heal the country. I think it was the same gesture of hope that he used when he created the Peace Corps. Remember, in the early 1960s, the United States was engaged in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But for Dad, I think it was a way to break down the walls of misunderstanding, to send young people out to countries all around the world, to show a different America, America that cared, America that had great hope. And I think it was his strong faith that demanded such actions of hope. And on the love front, a lot of people have laughed that my father, really greatest sign of hope was his courtship over 7 years of my mother. But he did have that courtship over 7 years and ended up being married happily for 56 years. And I think it was that sign of hope that also created the Special Olympics to try to knock down the walls of misunderstanding and prejudice against people with developmental disabilities. I want to read you this great line where I think his signs of hopefulness and love, really, as a father, came clearest to all of us. It was, my father used to write us notes almost every day. And when I lived at home in high school, he'd slip them under the door. And they were comments about anything, a baseball game, the conversation at dinner the night before. This one time when I had moved in after Jeannie and I had been married a year, he wrote, "Dear Mark, I notice you continue to cut your face shaving quite often. Believe me, if you use this razor, almost any shaving cream, this aftershave lotion, and this septic pencil in case you do cut your face, you will be able to dispense with all the toilet paper applications on your face. And your face, and probably your wife, will thank you. You will look and smell better. Love, Daddy." The guy noticed everything in people's lives. And he noticed the pain that my brother Bobby was going through after he had been arrested in the late 60s for smoking marijuana. And my brother tells a story, and I tell it a little bit here in the book, about how painful it was to be arrested, to have the embarrassing situation be on the front page of the New York Times. And he said, "I was 16 years old in 1970 and got into serious trouble." This was his eulogy to my dad at his funeral. "I was arrested for smoking marijuana. A lot of police officers came to our house in Hyannisport and served arrest warrants on my cousin and me. Prior to that moment, I was a normal 16-year-old boy. I had my Beatles and Stones records. I was mad at my mother, who I said I couldn't go to Woodstock because I was too young. I had a crush on a neighborhood girl who never noticed me. I tried so hard to be cool, and I knew deep in my heart that I was not cool at all. I was very aware of the Kennedy family position and more than a little scared about it. Uncle Bobby had died a few years ago, and Uncle Jack only 7 years earlier. Uncle Teddy's name was everywhere as a candidate for president in 1972, and I was terrified that he too would be shot by some madman. More than anything, as Timmy said, I wanted to be a man, but I could not be. I was just a boy. So being arrested for drugs, witnessing the arrival of 1,000 journalists at our door, it's hard to believe, but it's really true. And seeing the story on the front page of the New York Times above the fold was an enormous personal failure, a complete humiliation, public humiliation in all the obvious ways, private humiliation in a very deep way. I let my family down. I dishonored my father's name and my mother's name. In the house, before Daddy arrived, the lawyers came and went. A barber arrived and cut my long, cool hair to a crew cut. There were many disapproving looks, and it was a rough period. Then Dad arrived and told me to come into his room. It was a very, very long walk into his room. He sat me down on the edge of his bed, pulled up a chair, looked me right in the eye, and said, "Listen, you're a good kid. Don't listen to anyone else. I'm your father, and I'm going to take care of you. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," I said, and that was it. No moralizing, no criticizing. I went back to my room, and I knew I was safe, and so it was. Bobby continued on and said, "This is a story of my father saving my life, of how I always saw manliness and strength. It's a sad story because I know many boys and girls don't have a dad like my father, and they have to struggle without the strength of such a person. I hope you feel in the telling of my story today some of the overwhelming gratitude I felt that day for my father. I say goodbye to him today with that gratitude very deeply and strongly in my heart." I was always touched by the point that Bobby said that's how he saw manliness. He wasn't like so many guys think that we have to be today, yelling and dominating our kids and telling them who's boss. He was very calm, my dad was, because I believe it, and his faith in God told him that here was his son who he loved, to forgive him and to move on. So what's the point of me telling you all these stories? I think if you're watching this video still at this point, you're thinking that I'm an egomaniac and that I think that my father is an absolutely perfect person. And you think, what's the matter with these guys? And I think that when, I want to share one line that President Clinton said in the eulogy of my father, where he addressed this issue. "I had the opportunity," President Clinton said, "to observe Sarge in 2 settings, which answered a question."
Which answered a question that even in the most hopeful times was hard to answer with a straight face. Could anybody really be as good as he seemed to be? I mean, come on now. I mean, this is like, come on. Every other man in this church feels about 2 inches tall right now. Because he knew that what matters is the moment and eternity. And most of us waste countless hours trying to rewrite the past or elevate our position in the future in a way that doesn't amount to a hill of beans and keeps us from making the most of the moment. I have never met a man in my life who was happier in the moment than Sargent Shriver was, and who made more of it, and who thought less about how he could rewrite the past or rejigger the future to inflate himself above others. So I tell you, from the cynical, tough times of the late 60s and early 70s to this amazing moment, he really was as good as his family just told you.
He really was as good as his family just told you, and maybe even a little bit better. And a whole generation of us understood what President Kennedy meant by looking at Sargent Shriver's life. I wrote this book because I really didn't and hadn't really focused on my dad's life to see how it was that he was a good man. I spent too much time getting consumed by trying to get elected to public office, trying to make money, to create a platform where my opinion would matter here in Washington, D.C. and around the country. And I'd forgotten this very teacher in my midst. So I stepped back and looked at the life of a 95-year-old man who had suffered for 10 years under Alzheimer's, who had gotten crushed in his 2 elections for national office. And I tried to see what made him a good man. The first thing I figured out was that faith takes a lot of work. He went to Mass every day, and I mean at 7 a.m. every day. And whether we were here in Washington, D.C. or anywhere in the country or around the world, he went to Mass every day. And I could see him live his faith on a day in and day out basis. And my favorite story is when he came to the opening of the Choice Program, a program I started for juvenile delinquent kids, and Governor Shriver came. And my mom and I made a big stink over Governor Shriver, and everybody, the press and all the staff, went over to talk to the governor when he arrived. And I caught out of the corner of my eye my dad talking to a little African-American boy about 8 years of age. And they gesticulated, they were talking and moving their arms wildly. And I realized that that kid was never going to do anything for my father. And even though my father had great respect for and admiration for Governor Shriver, he was in the moment with that little boy. And that little boy was the most important person in the world. That was what made my father a great guy. My dad used to call us all the Lucky Seven. It was ironic because he was George McGovern's 7th choice for vice president, and they got crushed. But he always claimed that my 4 siblings and I, my mom and he, were the Lucky Seven. But when I've reflected on that title, I think really he should have called us the Blessed Seven, because we really were blessed. We weren't just lucky, we were blessed by God on so many different fronts. So today, as I wrap this long talk up, I think that we all are blessed to be associated with and to think about how we can help Catholic Charities. I think we need to think and to pray and to learn how we might be able to put our faith into action and to see that faith bring hope and love to so many people in our communities. And in so doing, we can help make gentle the world and make each of us a better human being, maybe even a good man or a good woman. Thanks very much for watching.